So we are here to talk about Fredrik's rather incredible book, Embers of War, which you should all go and buy immediately afterwards at the bookshop, and we'll be doing a signing at the end. But it's a book that sort of blew me away in many ways, because I think that everyone has lived with the incredible media that surrounds the Vietnam War, the movies, the songs, and the story of how America gets involved there in the first place is one that isn't widely known, particularly outside of the States and outside of Vietnam itself. And yet it's an extraordinary one, and I think with particular prescience now, with the kind of, America in Venezuela recently and all these threats with Greenland, the potential for American wars abroad has not been this real in quite a few years. And so it gives me great pleasure to be moderating this session. And I think it would be a good place to start. Let's go before the Americans arrive in what was then French Indo-China, and begin with where is French Indo-China and what are the French doing there?
Well, first off, it's just a pleasure to be with you and to have this opportunity in this extraordinary setting, to have a chance to talk about this book. Just delighted to be with you. French Indo-China is, of course, in Southeast Asia. And it is comprised really in the first instance of what we think of today as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The French arrived, Sam, I think primarily with commercial exploitation in mind. If you were to have a causal hierarchy of the reasons for French colonialism, I think you would put the commercial exploitation at the top as a source of raw materials, but also as a place for manufactured goods to be sold. In addition, I think there were geopolitical considerations. It was an age of empire. Now we're talking the late 19th century, a desire to keep up with the imperialistic Joneses, if you will. And Indochina was deemed to have strategic importance to French decision makers. And perhaps third, religious motivation was a desire on the part of Catholic leaders to bring God, if you will, to the heathen. Those things together, little by little, brought the French in, and by the mid-1880s, they had control, de facto control.
The thing that I've been reading about recently that I've been fascinated by was the influence of French India on French Indochina. The fact that despite this population always being very small, there was a very politically influential group of Pondicherry Tamils from French India who utilized the connections of the French Empire. And so I think 30% of the voting population of French Saigon was actually Pondicherry and Tamil. And so there were all sorts of bizarre connections between India and Indochina at the time as well. Let's come to the towering figure of Ho Chi Minh. I think one of the most politically important figures of the 20th century, and a kind of a roving, traveling revolutionary like few others. I can't really think of any global revolutionary who did so much, founded so many organizations in so many different countries, and made the rather astonishing transition from pastry chef to kind of, founder of a revolutionary republic in a matter of decades. Tell us about him.
Well, one of the things, now that I'm writing a biography of John F. Kennedy, I think about the so-called biographer's curse, which is that you come to identify too much with your subject. I may have fallen victim to this a little bit also with Ho Chi Minh, because he is, as you say, one of the extraordinary figures of the 20th century. And so to make him central in my story in Embers of War, which of course he is, and to look at, and I begin the book really with him in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference. He rents a morning coat so that he can look presentable as he seeks a meeting with Woodrow Wilson, the great American president.
Who he idolizes.
Who he idolizes. And he had spent time in Boston, where I now live, as you say, as a pastry chef, and he had been in London. But he seeks this meeting with Wilson, which he never gets. But it's really, in some ways, the beginning of this extraordinary journey. And I say in the book that by the end of his life, his face was more recognizable. He was arguably more important than the very statesman who snubbed him at Versailles in 1919. So he is absolutely central to this story. One of the themes in the book, which surprised me in the research, was how long Ho believed that the Americans, who after all were themselves, the United States was itself born out of an anti-colonial reaction, how long he believed that the Americans will be there for me in the end. He was so reluctant to let that go. He had read up on the American Declaration of Independence. He had listened to Wilson's pronouncements, later FDR during the war. And I think well into the French War, Ho believed, yeah, the Americans will come around. They know what this is about. Am I really so different than your George Washington in that
This is the line phrase? I love.
And of course, he ultimately becomes disillusioned. He comes to realize, I think by 48, 49, I guess I can't have the Americans. I won't have the Americans. But for a long time, he believes that he will.
And there's a wonderful picture in your book of Ho sitting alongside a bunch of kind of American soldiers during World War II.
Yeah, I mean,
playing cards.
The forerunner to the CIA, which, as I think many of you know, is the so-called is the OSS, Organization of Strategic Services. To a stunning degree, individual members of the OSS said to Washington, "We should work with this guy. We should be supportive of Ho. If we're not supportive of Ho and his desire for independence for Vietnam, we will be on the wrong side of history." And so he has these close ties with the OSS.
During World War II, the Japanese take over French Indochina. France, of course, falls under the sway of the Nazis. The French Empire kind of collapses and the Japanese take over. But when the Japanese surrender, Ho sees his opportunity and declares independence for Vietnam, notably Vietnam and not French Indochina. He's just declaring independence for a part of French Indochina. But you say that his Declaration of Independence is essentially modeled on the US Declaration of Independence, and he still, as late as 1945, is modeling himself on the American Revolution to some extent.
Yeah, I think the opening words, which will sound familiar to you, of that Vietnamese declaration is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And it's a naked play. I think it's genuine. I think he admires that declaration, but he's also playing for American support. I suggest in the book, this is a story with a number of contingent moments when the outcome could have been different. And right here, in August of 1945, one of those contingent moments, an open moment, when I think things could have been different. So, for example, if Franklin Roosevelt had lived, and let's remember, FDR was 63 when he died. He was a young man. We don't think of that because he served almost 4 terms, but he was young. So it's not hard to imagine him living at least another year or two. I think the outcome could have been different because of FDR's visceral dislike or hatred of European colonialism, and maybe the French version in particular. He had passed from the scene. Truman didn't have that same aversion.
Ultimately, though, so he passes away, and after World War II, the French announced that they're going to kind of recapture their lost colonies, but remarkably, and I think with particular prescience to this audience, in a story that isn't widely known in India, but is in Vietnam, the French, still recovering from Nazi occupation, don't really have an army yet to reconquer Vietnam. And so they ask the British to send in the Indian Army to reconquer Vietnam. So the first shots of the Vietnam War are fired by Punjabis and Gurkhas in Saigon when the Indian Army is sent to put down, get Ho Chi Minh out of Government House. Tell us about this extraordinary story.
I mean, it's unbelievable. It goes back to the Potsdam Conference earlier that summer, when, as Sam says, the British it was decided that the British would take the lead south of the 16th parallel to disarm the Japanese, to restore order, if you will, and in fact, quietly, to restore French authority. Lord Mountbatten says, okay, we'll do this, but there are not British Army conscripts available for this task. So as Sam says, he turns to mostly the 20th Division of the Indian Army for this task. And as you say, the first clashes between Vietnamese nationalists, so-called Viet Minh, and both Japanese, think about this, Japanese imperial forces, Indian forces, waging battle against the Viet Minh. It's an extraordinary thing. Nehru is among the first to say, Asians should not be fighting other Asians who are fighting for their independence. And it doesn't last very long, but it's this, as you say, this incredible moment in those first months of the struggle.
This is notably the last conflict, I think, along with the Battle of Surabaya in Indonesia, that the Indian Army is deployed by British colonial authorities. So the last time before the army is divided between India and Pakistan is the Indian Army fighting against the Viet Minh. And again, it's Mountbatten's job before being appointed Viceroy of India. So all sorts of important prescience in India, but a story that's remarkably unknown here. So in the wake of this, the Viet Minh sort of go underground and you begin to get fighting against French authority and the attempt to establish a revolutionary state. Tell us about kind of the period of 1950 when there sort of two states emerge for the first time in Vietnam, where the Americans recognize one state and China and Russia recognize the other state.
Yeah, this is, in 1949, we have what Americans come to call the twin shocks. Chinese victory, Mao's victory in the Chinese Civil War, and the Soviet detonation of an atomic bomb. And so, in a way, it's a crucial moment in the Cold War from an American perspective. I guess you could say from a Western perspective. And what happens in Indo-China is that the struggle is now internationalized, as you point out, because you have much more American aid flowing to the French, and then the Chinese, to a much, much lesser extent, now beginning to aid Ho and the Viet Minh. And so it becomes this international struggle, and the scale of the fighting picks up dramatically. Doesn't go particularly well for the French. Little by little, they lose ground. But for reasons we can get into, they are determined to try to stick this out with strong and growing encouragement from the Americans.
Strong and growing encouragement, but when JFK, the figure of your new biography, and I might add a new Netflix show, which we can again try to get into a bit later, arrives in 1951 for the first time. He already in 1951, before the first US troops on the ground, already JFK thinks it's all over and that there's no real chance.
This is not only because I'm working on the book on Kennedy now, but it's just this amazing moment to me that this young congressman, wet behind the ears, arrives in Vietnam with his brother Bobby and their sister Patricia, meets with senior French officials, looks around, takes it all in, and decides the French are not going to win. And I think he says, by extension, no Western power in this part of the world is going to be able to defeat nationalists by force of arms. That is a conviction that I think the young JFK reaches here in the fall of 1951. I don't think, to skip ahead to my current project, I don't think President Kennedy, a decade later, has really changed his mind about this. And so there's a paradox that I have to try to explain in my biography. How does this same Kennedy nevertheless escalate US involvement dramatically, or not dramatically, but substantially, during his 1,000 days in the White House? That's a puzzle that I need to try to solve in the current biography.
You have this extraordinary sort of series of the next 3 years after Kennedy's visit, when more and more the Cold War is developing and the US begins to dig in with this idea that communism needs to be halted, that they need to do all that they can to prop up French imperialism, despite earlier the US having been very anti-imperialist. Suddenly the US is trying to prop up the French because they're so scared about Ho Chi Minh taking over. And what's extraordinary that I hadn't properly registered before reading your book is the fact that many of the French soldiers who are dying in Vietnam are actually Algerians and Moroccans, and again, French, just as the British army in World War II is actually the British Empire's army, and it's often Indians who make up the vast majority of troops. So the French army is actually Algerians, Moroccans, and Vietnamese, and Laotians and Cambodians.
Yeah, and also a sizable number of legionnaires, especially Germans. It's a very unusual, shall we say, fighting force that the French deploy. The other thing that's just so notable about this period, 51 to 54, is how by the end of it, the Americans are more committed to the French war than are the French themselves.
By Dien Bien Phu, you seem
Certainly but long before Dien Bien Phu, the French are basically saying to themselves and to the Americans, why is it that the Americans are allowed to negotiate with communists in Korea, but they're not letting us negotiate with communists in Indo-China? And so that part of the story, that the degree to which the Americans, as you pointed out, become so invested in a French victory, more so than the French themselves, is something, when I was doing my research, I didn't anticipate, and it blew my mind. And I think it's key to understanding why the war lasts as long as it did, and also key to understanding why Ho, again, long before Dien Bien Phu, told his associates, our principal adversary in this struggle is in fact the United States. The Americans, he understood, to a large degree are going to drive what the French do the rest of the way.
By this point, Ho's given up on the idea of help.
By this point, he's given up, reluctantly, at long last, the idea that the Americans will be my supporters in the end. He's given up on that.
Take us to, one of the most significant battles of the 20th century, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which you have a series of extraordinary pictures in the book of the fact that they're all this famous battle, the most significant battle, the most significant defeat of the French in their history. One of the few set-piece battles where anti-colonial nationalists win on a battlefield against their imperial rulers. And all the pictures that you have are showing the fact that they're all using American weapons, they're using American planes, some of them are wearing American uniforms. So the Americans, there are no American troops on the ground yet, but already America's presence is there in Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, this battle was just so revelatory for me to research, to try to understand French decision-making in making a stand in this remote part of of Vietnam near the Laotian border. I had a chance to visit Dien Bien Phu, so I could see. You write better history, I think, when you can visit a place. I know you feel the same way. Able to see where the battle took place. And I had come to realize when I was researching this that the French decision-making, which seems so preposterous in hindsight, had at least something to recommend it. That if you could draw the Viet Minh into this kind of set-piece battle, French superior arms, French artillery would annihilate the Viet Minh. Didn't work out that way, but it seemed less crazy at the time than it would subsequently seem. But what you then have, as you point out, is this battle that rages, in which the French suffer colossal defeats over a period of weeks. And then it is symbolically, I think it's fair to say, the end of the French Indo-China War. Not literally, because we still have the Geneva Conference, we still have some fighting after Dien Bien Phu, but I think we can say symbolically this is the end, French defeat. And then, and we can come back to this, the Americans in the months thereafter, under President Eisenhower, will face a monumental decision. Do we cut our losses? Or do we try to create a non-communist bastion in the southern part of Vietnam? This is all in the wake of Dien Bien Phu.
Two things I want to just quickly mention at this point. One is the general, I think, behind the Vietnamese victory, Giap, is a rather extraordinary figure himself, and I'd love you to comment on him. But secondly, this thing that you just have a throwaway line on, but it blew my mind. The US, in the middle of the battle, offers the French 2 atom bombs. Tell us about that.
So we'll deal with both of these. So General Giap, he I would say second only to Ho Chi Minh himself, is the central figure on the Viet Minh side of the French, of the war against the French. Mostly self-taught, had learned a great deal, obviously in the early years of the struggle, which he applied as the battle went on, like a good commander does, and made his share of mistakes, which I detail in the book. He got overconfident. When they had success in a given battle, he not often, but he occasionally forgot about the reasons for that success, and they didn't apply in the new situation. So he made mistakes, but he learned from them. I think a marvelous both tactician and strategist, and an amazing figure. So there was a plan in this intense deliberations in Washington in March and April of 1954. How do we try to save the French position at Dien Bien Phu? What can we do? And there is an intense discussion in Washington about Western intervention to try to save the French. And in fact, I argue that Dwight Eisenhower, often seen to be very reluctant, was prepared to go in with air power. But he couldn't get Congress to go along because Congress needed the British to go along, and Eden and Churchill refused. There was an atomic dimension to this plan. And the French said, please, no, because any atomic bomb that is used is going to kill not only Viet Minh units, it's also going to kill the garrison. It never came that close, I think, to realization, but you're quite right that there is an atomic dimension to this plan.
So, in the wake of the greatest French defeat sort of ever, this extraordinary set-piece battle that is not guerrilla fighters kind of, chucking bombs into cafes in Saigon. This is Vietnamese and French troops pitched on a battle against one another, and the Vietnamese win. Very soon after this, though, the Vietnamese themselves are extraordinarily exhausted. The French begin to kind of plan to pull out, And it seems to be, according to your book, the Chinese who suggest the plan to partition Indo-China into several new states, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, as a temporary division, but also separating off Cambodia and Laos as sovereign states. And you, in a way that I haven't seen treated in the same way in other books, talk about it remarkably similar to the way that, partition is talked about here. 900,000 people are displaced by the partition of Indo-China. The largest civilian evacuation in history. Unlike the Indian and Pakistani partition, you don't have mobs attacking each other. It's very orderly. The French and I think US, is the US Navy involved in shipping civilians as well?
Absolutely.
Which gives a kind of much more orderly dimension to this partition. But tell us about this seminal moment. We're in 1954 now.
Yes, and I think it's especially interesting to look at this from the Viet Minh perspective. So try to place yourself in the position of Ho and his lieutenants. By any fair judgment of the situation on the battlefield, they should get, if not all of Vietnam, they should get the vast majority of it. And here the Chinese and the Soviets are putting pressure on them at Geneva to take much less and to have a partition at the 17th parallel. And for a time, the Viet Minh say, no, it should be further south. And the French and the Americans counter and say it should be higher up. Eventually, it is settled on the 17th parallel. And Ho is a realist. Ho is a pragmatist. And he decides, this was not universally popular among the Viet Minh leadership, but he decides we're going to take half a loaf now. We'll accept this partition. And then in due course, presumably by election, we will get a reunified Vietnam under our control. And that's the decision he makes. Fateful decision. And that's what we then see, an agreement to divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. It's supposed to be temporary. Within 2 years, there will be elections for reunification. Everybody, by the way, believes, including Dwight Eisenhower, that a fair election would go to Ho Chi Minh. Very few people are under any illusion about that. But that's how we get this partition, which again is supposed to be temporary. It becomes somewhat longer than that, although not as long as the case of, obviously, partition here.
The other, just to finish off with probably 2 more questions before we open up to the audience, so do get thinking about the questions you'd like to ask. But you have this extraordinary thing where France finally pulls its last troops out of Indochina in April 1956. And at that time, as late as April, everyone thinks that later that year there will be an election. Within a matter of months, the Americans are basically pushing against that idea and seem to be backing South Vietnam in a rather extraordinary way with new weapons. And it's really here that you begin to get the American feet on the ground. Tell us what happens between 56 and the first US soldiers to be killed in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's, I said a moment ago that there are these open moments when the story, it seems to me, is contingent, when the outcome could have been different. I think of that with respect to 1954 because Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State, have a huge decision to make. What are we going to do in Indochina? And I think they make a decision which is to try to create and sustain this non-communist bastion in the southern part of Vietnam. And they have a leader in Ngo Dinh Diem, who we haven't mentioned yet, leader in Saigon, who is an important figure, who I think the early scholarship tended to belittle him, but in fact, I think he was a courageous patriot, but who was determined to avoid this election called for at Geneva. The Americans wanted him actually to consult with the North Vietnamese, and he wouldn't even do that. So in a sense, he was even more intransigent than the Americans. The point is the election doesn't happen, and then after 1956, slowly but surely, an insurgency develops in South Vietnam with support and ultimately direction from North Vietnam, first under Ho and then under Le Duan, who becomes the most important decision maker in Hanoi. This insurgency begins. The US responds with more aid to South Vietnam. That takes us through the Eisenhower years, and then, as I pointed out, and as I'm now writing about with JFK, he has to decide after he becomes president. And let's remember, he's the guy who was a skeptic, as I pointed out, and I think remains one about the possibility of a military solution in Vietnam. He now has to make a decision, what do I do? And it's, as we know, he stays in, and then we see the rapid, huge Americanization of the war under his successor. After the assassination in Dallas, that's of course Lyndon Johnson. That brings us into a large-scale American war.
I think this is a good moment to open up for questions. Do we have roaming mics, volunteers? Yes, we've got mics in the audience, so please put up your hands, and we want questions, not statements, please. We will ask you to be brief. Any questions?
I see somebody down here.
There's someone here in the brown shirt, and then someone in the corner on the bottom left over here. The man in the brown shirt first. And could we have another mic down to the top left over here for the next question?
Hello.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what economic benefits USA was hoping to achieve when it started, militarizing that military forces deployed in Vietnam?
The economic benefits. It's a very good question. I expected when I started my research to see more expressions by American officials that there were important economic imperatives at play. In other words, that economics would drive the decision making. I didn't see it so much. Yes, there's a sense that Eisenhower has, other US officials have, that the resources of Southeast Asia could be important in the broader Cold War. I don't think it drives the decision making. And in fact, by the time we get into the mid-1960s, and the Americanization of the war happens, I think you'll see that corporate America, Wall Street, is very skittish about whether this is a good thing or not. Because as we know, business interests tend to like stability, and a large-scale American war half a world away is not going to be promoting stability. And so I don't see, I may be putting things a bit too starkly here, but I don't think that those economic imperatives were nearly as important as I thought they would be when I started the research.
We have one question at the front, and then lady at the back next. If we could get a mic to the lady in the back. Yes, here.
After the war, Jawaharlal Nehru and others had started the non-aligned movement. Dr. Ho Chi Minh was part of that movement, wasn't he? Do you remember which year he visited India?
Ho Chi Minh's visit to India.
Trick question. No, not a trick question, but,
No,
but I don't remember actually.
I remember meeting him.
Ah,
That's why I'm asking.
you met him.
I've met him.
What year was this?
And that's what I'm asking you. No, the point I'm making is that this non-aligned movement was important at that time, although Western scholars tend to denigrate it. And Dr. Ho Chi Minh was part of that, with Archbishop Macarius and General Nasser and so on. So I don't know whether you've glossed over that bit at all.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the non-aligned movement was important. Mid-50s, in particular, 55 and 56, it had a surge in terms of its global impact. I'm originally from Sweden, And there were Swedish intellectuals at the time who said, we, this little Scandinavian country, should really be a part of this non-aligned movement. But there is great hope attached to it, as you point out, for a period of time. And you're absolutely right that Ho was perceived to be a very important figure in this movement. I think he himself, as you point out, maybe he said this when you met him, would be an important part of that movement, no question.
One of the things that I found fascinating about Fredrik's book, India shows up fleetingly at certain moments, but it's sort of consistently important turning points. Nehru randomly will show up and kind of force through a major decision, as we mentioned earlier, the decision to not allow the Indian troops in Vietnam, etc. I was also very taken visiting, I think it's the Indira Gandhi's old house in Lutyens, Delhi, where there is a portrait of Ho Chi Minh signed to Mrs. Gandhi as a child when she was, when she was a young girl running around, and you have Ho Chi Minh's portrait there. There was someone at the back here who might have the yes, and then there's another man here in the front, and that's probably the last question. Man at the front, but first person at the back.
The wisdom behind the US entering the war was they believed in the domino theory.
Yes.
If they go communist, then things will happen.
Yeah.
So the whole wall raged, and communists did take over. So what happened to the dominoes after that?
Well, it's a great question, and I should have mentioned it. It's such an arresting notion, which I think is why it took hold. If you topple one domino, then all the other dominoes will fall. So if one country falls, others will fall. It's, of course, associated with Eisenhower, press conference in 1954. But long before that, the basic imagery was in place. I found documents in the British archives where British officials in 1946 and 47 are basically articulating the domino theory. We can't allow even part of Indo-China to fall. We've got to support the French because our position otherwise will be threatened. And I think the domino theory has resonance in American decision-making, British decision-making, to some extent French decision-making for quite a long time. Interestingly, under Kennedy, to come back to him again, this begins to lose resonance. I think by the early 60s, officials are saying, actually, what happens within a given country depends on conditions in that country. It's not about dominoes. It's not about what's happening next door. And then I think what happens is that it becomes more about credibility. There's an interesting shift because they're related. Geographic dominoes falling to the notion of almost a psychological domino theory, which is our credibility will be at stake if we fail to stand firm in Vietnam.
There is, just before we leave this question, one of the scenes in my book, Shattered Lands, that I found most surprising was the fact that India and Pakistan in the late 1940s, early 1950s, after the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, also start to worry about domino theory. They see China going communist, their big neighbor, and then it looks like there's going to be a communist revolution in neighboring Burma, Myanmar. And one of the few moments where India and Pakistan begin to share intelligence with one another, like Pathan or one of these movies where the ISI and RAW officers are working together and fall in love. This kind of sort of thing actually happens for about 5 years in Rangoon, where Indian and Pakistani secret intelligence are working together to try and stop their neighborhood being filled with more communist states in a way that I think isn't talked about enough. We have one more question by the man over here, and then I think we're going to have to call it a day.
Yeah, hi. Do you think as a historian, has history repeated itself or rhymed itself through Iran, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and all these strands of history, if at all?
In US involvement in Afghanistan? Does history rhyme with these repeated...
Yes, I mean, I do think, obviously, there are very important differences between American intervention in Vietnam and later wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also important similarities. And I'll just mention one since we're out of time. The importance of perceived domestic political imperatives I find so striking, which is to say that when the doors are closed, US officials will say to themselves, you know, I'm not sure the outcome in Vietnam really matters, or it really matters what happens in Afghanistan, or that our credibility is truly at stake in Iraq. But I think for reasons that have to do with their domestic political standing, which is in the case of the presidents, it's about being elected and then re-elected. It's about their relations with Congress. I think that those imperatives become more and more important. So when we talk about credibility, it's not just about America's global credibility. It's also about partisan credibility and personal credibility. You know, I'll just mention one other point also before we finish with respect to the domino theory. Sam mentioned China, and I thought about this. If the domino theory held, shouldn't Mao's victory in China, huge country, huge population, cause all the dominoes around China to fall from a Western perspective? And yet it didn't really happen. So right away in 1949 and 50, people should have been able to say, wait a minute, this domino theory seems to be somewhat problematic. The Chinese example shows it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being such a wonderful and attentive audience. Do go to the bookshop and buy Embers of War. It's really, really amazing book. And Fredrik will be doing a book signing afterwards in the tent. So please join him for that. Thank you.